The first thing he saw was the skull of a child. It wasn't old and dusty, the kind of thing you'd see in a museum. It was new. Wet. A piece of the forehead was caved in, a perfect little circle, like someone had punched it out with a tool. Shards of bone were stuck in the pink, mushy stuff inside. He could smell it. A coppery, sweet smell, like a butcher shop left open in the summer heat. Then the image was gone, replaced by the scent of pine-scented cleaner and the squeak of his own rubber-soled shoes on the linoleum. Frank Sullivan stumbled back, his mop clattering to the floor. His heart was a drum solo against his ribs. He was in the main rotunda of the Harmony Creek Observatory, a place he'd cleaned 5 nights a week for 12 years. It was always quiet, always the same. The low hum of the servers in the back room, the faint smell of old paper from Dr. Arris's office, the big silent telescope aimed at the heavens like a cannon meant for God. But tonight was different. Tonight, there was a hole in the dome. It was a ragged tear in the fiberglass, maybe 3 feet across. Moonlight streamed through, illuminating a cloud of swirling dust motes. And directly below it, sitting dead center on the polished floor he'd just finished, was the thing. It wasn't big, no larger than a bowling ball. It wasn't a meteorite, not like the pocked, crusty ones they had in the display case. This thing was smooth, a deep, featureless black that seemed to drink the light. It didn't reflect the moonbeam, it just swallowed it. His janitor's brain screamed at him. Something had made a mess on his floor. A big one, shingles and insulation, was scattered around the black object. His duty was to clean it up. But another part of his brain, a deeper, older part, was screaming something else. Run. He didn't run. He was 53 years old with a bad knee and a mortgage. You don't run from a mess. You deal with it. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. The air around the object felt strange, cold. It made the hairs on his arms stand up. There was a sound coming from it, a low thrumming hum that wasn't just a sound you heard with your ears. He felt it in his teeth, in the bones of his skull. He knelt down, his bad knee protesting with a loud crack. He shouldn't touch it. He knew that. This was a job for Dr. Arris, for the police, for somebody with a better paycheck and a hazmat suit. But the hum was inviting. It felt like a song he'd almost forgotten the words to. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling. He told himself he was just going to feel if it was hot. A simple test. His fingertip brushed the surface. It wasn't hot or cold. It wasn't anything. For a second, nothing happened. Then the world vanished. He wasn't Frank Sullivan, janitor, anymore. He was standing on a field of glass under a blood-red sun. The air tasted of ash. All around him were figures in silver armor, their faces hidden by blank helmets. They held rifles that fired screaming beams of light. Their targets weren't soldiers. They were people. Unarmed. Dressed in rags. They ran and they screamed and they fell, their bodies turning to black char on the glass field. Then the image changed. He was in a chrome room. A woman was strapped to a table, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it felt holy. A man in a clean white coat stood over her, holding a device that looked like a corkscrew. The man wasn't angry. He was calm. He was bored. He looked at his watch, then turned the crank on the device. The woman's scream had no sound, but Frank felt it tear through his soul. Another flash, a city of towering spires, beautiful and perfect. But the streets were empty. Then he looked closer and saw the gutters were filled, not with water but with teeth. Piles and piles of human teeth like gravel. Another, the child's skull, the wet broken bone. This time he saw the hand that did it. It was a small hand, the hand of another child. The child smiled, a sweet, innocent smile, as it pulled its hand away. Frank screamed and scrambled backward, crab walking away from the black sphere, his hands slapping against the cold floor. The images were gone, but the feelings remained. The terror, the despair, the absolute crushing weight of what he had seen. It was history. He knew it somehow. Not the history he'd learned in school, with its wars and its famines and its plagues. That was just practice. That was the clumsy, fumbling rehearsal. What he had seen, what the black thing had shown him, was the grand performance. He lay on the floor, gasping for breath, the smell of pine cleaner mixing with the phantom scent of burnt flesh and blood. The old history books were wrong. They were fairy tales. Humanity's story wasn't written in ink. It was going to be written in blood and screams, on a scale that made Genghis Khan look like a schoolyard bully. And Frank Sullivan, the man who mopped the floors, was the first one to read the preface. The phone felt heavy in Frank's shaking hand. He dialed Dr. Aris's number, a number he'd only ever used twice before. Once when the main boiler went out, and once when he'd accidentally locked himself in the supply closet. This felt 1,000 times worse. The phone rang 4 times before a sleepy, irritated voice answered. "What is it, Frank?" "Dr. Aris, you need to come down here, to the observatory." Frank's voice was a ragged whisper. "It's 3 in the morning. Did the boiler go out again? Just put the bucket under it. I'll call the repairman in the morning." "No, sir. It's something came through the roof, the dome." There was a pause. Frank could hear the sound of sheets rustling. Dr. Aris was sitting up now. "Came through the roof? What are you talking about?" "A branch." "No, sir, it's not a branch. It's a thing. It's on the floor. It made a hole." "Frank, are you drunk?" "No, sir, I swear to God. Please, you just need to see it." The desperation in his own voice scared him. He sounded like a crazy person. Maybe he was. Maybe he'd finally snapped from the monotony and the ammonia fumes. Maybe the black sphere was just a hallucination, a short circuit in his tired brain. He hoped it was. He prayed for it. Another pause, longer this time. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't touch anything, and for God's sake, don't call the papers." The line went dead. Frank slid down the wall, his back pressed against the cool plaster. He kept his eyes on the sphere. It just sat there, silent and black, a hole in reality. The humming had stopped, or maybe he'd just gotten used to it. The horrific images flickered at the edges of his vision, like the afterimage of a camera flash. The child's skull, the field of glass, the gutter of teeth. He squeezed his eyes shut, but that only made them clearer. He forced himself to think about something else, anything else. His wife Martha sleeping at home, the leaky faucet. In their bathroom, the crossword puzzle he hadn't finished. Normal things, mundane things. But they felt flimsy, like a paper shield against a hurricane. The things he had seen felt more real than his own life. Dr. Aris arrived in 19 minutes, looking flustered in a rumpled tweed jacket thrown over a pair of pajamas. He was a small, bird-like man with spectacles that were always perched on the end of his nose. He took one look at the hole in the dome, then at the black object on the floor, and his sleepy irritation vanished, replaced by an electric curiosity. "My God," he whispered, walking slowly toward it. He didn't look at Frank. His eyes were glued to the sphere. Incredible. The trajectory, the lack of a significant impact crater. It must have decelerated. Dr. Aris, be careful. Frank's voice was hoarse. Aris waved a dismissive hand. It's a meteorite, Frank. A highly unusual one, but a meteorite nonetheless. Probably a carbonaceous chondrite with an unusually high iron content, hence the density and color. He was talking more to himself than to Frank. He knelt down, just as Frank had, his eyes gleaming with scientific fervor. "Don't touch it," Frank said louder this time. The words came out with more force than he intended. Aris looked up annoyed. "Frank, I'm an astrophysicist. This is literally my job. I need to get a sample, run a spectral analysis." He pulled a small geologist's hammer from his jacket pocket. Frank hadn't even noticed he was carrying it. "I touched it, sir," Frank said quietly. "It did something to me." Aris paused, the hammer raised. "Did what? Gave you a static shock?" "It showed me things, awful things." Dr. Aris sighed, a puff of condescending air. "Frank, you've had a shock. A meteorite just crashed through your workplace. It's perfectly natural for your mind to play tricks on you. Adrenaline can cause hallucinations." He turned his attention back to the sphere. "Now, if you'll excuse me." He reached out, not with a hammer, but with his bare hand. The same way Frank had, his fingers were long and thin, like a pianist's. He was going to touch it. "No!" Frank yelled, scrambling to his feet. But it was too late. Dr. Aris's index finger made contact with the smooth black surface. For a second, nothing happened. Dr. Aris had a small, triumphant smile on his face, a look that said, "See? Perfectly harmless." Then the smile froze. His eyes widened behind his thick glasses. The color drained from his face, leaving it the color of spoiled milk. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His body went rigid, his hand still pressed against the sphere. He looked like a statue of a man who had just seen the face of hell. Then he collapsed, his head hitting the linoleum with a sickening thud. He didn't twitch. He didn't move. He just lay there, a crumpled heap of tweed and terror, next to the silent black object from the sky. Frank was alone again, but now the silence was worse. It was the silence of a tomb. He wasn't the only one who had read the preface anymore. The first call Frank made was to 911. His voice was steadier now, stripped of panic and replaced by a hollow, chilling calm. The visions were still there, buzzing in the back of his mind like a trapped fly. But the immediate crisis of Dr. Aris, lying unconscious on the floor, gave him a grim purpose. "Here's been an accident at the observatory," he told the dispatcher. "My boss, Dr. Aris, he's collapsed. He's not breathing." He wasn't sure if that last part was true, but it felt true. The second call was to the one person in Harmony Creek he trusted to handle weirdness. Without flying off the handle, Sheriff Brody. Brody had been the sheriff for 30 years. He'd seen everything the small Nebraska town had to offer, from tractor theft to the occasional meth lab bust out in the cornfields. He was a big man, built like a refrigerator, with a slow way of talking that made people think he was slow-witted. They were always wrong. "Frank? What's wrong?" Brody's voice was thick with sleep but alert. "Jim, it's Frank Sullivan. Down at the observatory. You need to get here. The paramedics are on their way, but you need to see this before they get here." "See what? What's going on?" There was an object. It came through the roof. Dr. Aris touched it and he just dropped. There was a long silence on the line. Frank could hear the faint sound of a dog barking in the background. "Stay right there, Frank. Don't let anyone else touch it. I am on my way. Brody arrived before the ambulance, his cruiser pulling up without a siren. He came in, his boots making heavy, solid sounds on the floor. He took in the scene with a sweep of his tired eyes. The hole in the ceiling, the unconscious form of Dr. Aris, Frank standing pale and trembling by the wall, and the black sphere sitting in the middle of it all like a patient spider. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, Brody muttered. He walked a wide circle around the sphere, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He didn't get too close. What in God's name is that? I don't know, Frank said. It came out of the sky. I touched it. Then he touched it. Brody looked at Frank, his gaze sharp. And what happened when you touched it, Frank? Frank opened his mouth to explain, to tell him about the glass field in the chrome room and the smiling child. But the words wouldn't come. How could he describe it? It would sound like madness. I saw things. Bad things. Brody nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the sphere. All right. The paramedics arrived a minute later, a young man and woman full of professional urgency. They rushed to Dr. Aris's side, starting their work. What happened? The young man asked, checking Aris's pulse. He just collapsed, Brody said, his voice taking on an official tone. We think maybe a gas leak. Something in the air. He shot Frank a look that said, play along. The female paramedic looked over at the sphere. What's that? Don't touch it, Brody and Frank said in unison. The paramedic froze, her hand halfway towards her medical kit. She looked from the two men to the object and decided to listen. They got Dr. Aris onto a gurney. As they were wheeling him out, his eyes fluttered open. He looked around, his gaze wild and unfocused. He tried to sit up. The patterns, he gasped, his voice a dry rattle. The equations, they're not for building things. They're for taking them apart, atom by atom. He looked at Frank, his eyes filled with a terrifying, brilliant clarity. They didn't conquer the stars, Frank. They unraveled them. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he was gone again. The paramedics exchanged a worried look and hurried out the door. Brody turned back to Frank. The hell did he mean by that? The things I saw, Frank said, the words finally spilling out. It's a history, I think. Our history. The one that hasn't happened yet, and it's wrong. It's so much worse than we think. Brody was quiet for a long time, just staring at the silent black rock. The morning light was starting to creep in through the windows, a pale gray light that made everything look old and sad. The sphere didn't reflect it. It just sat there, a patch of absolute night. Okay, Brody said finally, letting out a long breath. I am going to have to call some people about this, Frank. People from a lot farther away than Omaha. He pulled out his radio. But first, we're getting this thing out of here. He called in his deputy, a young, eager kid named Peters. I want you to get the thickest evidence bag we have, and some of those heavy-duty insulated gloves from the emergency kit, Brody instructed. We're going to treat this thing like it's radioactive. Peters, wide-eyed and excited by the break in routine, did as he was told. With Brody directing, they managed to carefully scoop the sphere into the thick plastic bag. It was heavier than it looked, a dead, solid weight. As Peters sealed the bag, his gloved knuckle brushed against the plastic, right where the sphere was resting inside. He flinched. Who? Where? What is it, son? Brody asked. Peters shook his head, a strange, vacant look in his eyes. Just for a second there, I saw the prettiest garden. But the flowers, they were screaming. He blinked and the look was gone. He grinned a little shakily. Must be tired. Long night. Brody's face was grim. He looked at Frank. The sickness was spreading, and it had only just begun. By sunrise, the Harmony Creek Observatory was cordoned off with yellow police tape. The official story, cooked up by Sheriff Brody over lukewarm coffee at the station, was a localized gas leak from some old experimental chemicals Dr. Aris had stored. It was a flimsy story, but in a town where the biggest news was usually the county fair, it was enough to keep people away for now. The black sphere sat on the evidence table in the center of Brody's office. It was triple-bagged, but that didn't seem to matter. It had a presence. It was like having a black hole in the room, sucking up the light and the warmth and the peace of mind. Brody had given strict orders. No one enters the office without his permission. No one goes near the table. Of course, orders are only as good as the people who follow them. The first to break the rule was Millie, the town clerk who doubled as the station's part-time secretary. She came in around 10 with a stack of files, humming a cheerful tune. Brody was out getting more coffee, and Deputy Peters was supposed to be watching the office. But Peters was in the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face, trying to wash away the memory of screaming flowers. Millie saw the bagged object on the table. Curiosity, the most dangerous and human of all traits, got the better of her. She had heard the rumors flying around town. A meteorite, a piece of a Russian satellite, a weather balloon. She just wanted a peek. She crept over to the table and poked a bag with her pen. Nothing happened. Emboldened, she reached out and laid her hand flat against the plastic, feeling the hard, smooth curve beneath. Her humming stopped. The files slid from her other hand and scattered across the floor. She stood frozen for a full 30 seconds, her face a mask of placid horror. Then she blinked, shook her head as if to clear a bad dream, and slowly bent down to pick up her papers. She didn't say a word. She walked out of the office, her cheerful hum replaced by a dead, unnerving silence. Later that day, Frank saw her at the grocery store. She was standing in the canned goods aisle, staring at a pyramid of green beans. She wasn't seeing the cans. Her eyes were distant. Frank walked up to her. "Millie, are you all right?" She turned to him, her eyes focusing slowly. "They made a law," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "A law against sadness. If you cried, they took you away. They had these clinics to make you happy again. The walls were padded, so you wouldn't hurt yourself on the joy." She gave a small, terrible smile. It was very humane. Then she blinked, grabbed a can of green beans, and walked away as if nothing had happened. The infection was spreading like a ghost plague. A janitor who cleaned the station at night touched the bag out of sheer boredom. The next day he quit his job and spent hours sitting on a park bench, meticulously arranging fallen leaves into complex geometric patterns. When asked what he was doing, he'd just say, "I am trying to make the silence look pretty." A local handyman, Hank, who came in to fix a rattling air conditioner, leaned against the table. He stumbled out of the office a minute later, pale and sweating. He went home, took every photograph of his wife and children off the walls, and burned them in his backyard. "Memories are anchors," he told his crying wife. "We need to travel light for what's coming." Each person who came into contact with the sphere, even through the layers of plastic, saw a different piece of the future. It was like a giant, horrifying mosaic, and every person held a single unique tile. Frank had seen the brutal physical violence. Dr. Aris had seen the cold intellectual deconstruction of the universe. Deputy Peters saw the perversion of nature, Millie saw the forced suppression of emotion. Hank saw the destruction of personal connection. It wasn't chaos. Frank was beginning to realize that it was organized. It was systematic. It was a complete and total reimagining of what it meant to be human. And every change was a turn of the screw into deeper damnation. That evening, Frank and Sheriff Brody sat in Brody's office, the sphere sitting between them like a silent judge. The room felt cold. "It's a plague, Jim," Frank said, his voice low. "But it doesn't attack the body. It attacks the soul." Brody rubbed his tired face. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in one day. "I called the state police and the FBI. And NORAD. I basically went down the list of anyone who might listen to a crazy sheriff from the middle of nowhere. Someone's coming. Some special division. They're flying in from DC?" "And what do we do until then?" Frank asked. "Lock it in a vault?" "That's the problem," Brody said, gesturing at the black object. "That thing doesn't need to be touched anymore. It's in their heads now. Millie, Peters, Hank. They're the carriers. What happens when they start talking to other people? What happens when Millie's vision of a world without sadness starts to sound good to someone who's grieving? What happens when Hank's idea of burning memories appeals to someone with a dark past?" Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The sphere didn't just show you the future. It planted a seed, and now those seeds were scattered all over Harmony Creek, just waiting for the right conditions to grow. The future wasn't just coming, it was being invited in. The federal people arrived the next morning. They didn't come in marked cars or helicopters. They came in 2 black, nondescript sedans that slid into town as quietly as shadows. The men who got out weren't soldiers in uniform. They were men in identical dark suits, with blank faces and watchful eyes. They moved with a purpose that made Sheriff Brody's deputies look like clumsy teenagers. The man in charge introduced himself only as Mr. Jones. He was tall and thin, with pale skin and hair so black it looked dyed. He didn't shake Brody's hand. He just looked at him, then at Frank, who was also at the station. Jones's eyes seemed to assess and dismiss them in the same instant. "Sheriff Brody, you've had a busy couple of days," Jones said. It wasn't a question. His voice was flat without any trace of an accent. "Where is the object?" Brody led them to his office. Jones's 2 companions swept the room for bugs before he even stepped inside. Jones looked at the triple-badged sphere on the table. He showed no surprise, no curiosity. He looked at it, the way a farmer looks at a troublesome rock in his field. "Who has had physical contact?" Jones asked, his back to them. Brody listed them off. "Me and Frank here haven't, but my deputy, Peters, the town clerk, Millie, a handyman named Hank, and the station's night janitor, a fella named Carl. Oh, and Dr. Aris, the astrophysicist. He's in a coma at the county hospital." Jones made a small, almost imperceptible nod. One of his agents made a note on a small digital pad. "What did they see?" Jones asked. Frank and Brody spent the next hour trying to explain. They pieced together the fragments, the terrifying mosaic tiles, the screaming flowers, the law against sadness, the burning of memories, the unraveling of stars, the silent, pretty patterns of leaves. As they talked, Frank realized something new. None of the visions were about war in the way they understood it. There were no armies fighting over land or resources. This was different. This was a war against human nature itself. They weren't just killing people in the future. They were erasing what made them people in the first place. Jones listened without interruption. When they were finished, he was silent for a long moment. "We've seen similar phenomena before," he said, his voice still devoid of emotion. "Twice. Once in the Siberian tundra in '78. Once in the Atacama Desert in '93. The objects were different. A crystalline structure in Siberia. A metallic fluid in Atacama. But the effect was the same. Mass psychic contagion." Frank stared at him. "You mean this has happened before? Why isn't it in the news?" "Because we are then humorless smile. These things, we call them Chronos probes. We believe they are recorders, archives, sent by someone. They don't just show the future, they show a possible future. The most probable one, based on the current trajectory of the species they're observing." "And ours is that?" Brody asked, his voice strained. "The visions are becoming clearer with each new contact," Jones continued, ignoring the question. "They're starting to form a coherent narrative. The early stages are always about control. Control of emotion, of nature, of memory. Our analysts have names for the later stages, pieced together from the other two events. The Unity Wars, not wars between nations, but wars to enforce a single global consciousness. The Great Simplification, the systematic culling of those who cannot or will not integrate. And finally, the Perpetual Harvest." Jones paused. He looked at Frank, his eyes like chips of ice. "That's the end game. Once humanity is unified and simplified, it turns on itself for a purpose. It divides its own population into stock and hunter. It creates an endless ritualized conflict to maintain stability and purpose. A permanent state of controlled atrocity. They thought their history was bloody. They used that history to justify building a future that was infinitely worse, because it was organized, sanitized, and endless." The room was silent. Frank felt sick. The field of glass he had seen, the soldiers in silver armor hunting people in rags. It wasn't a war, it was a harvest. The most terrifying part wasn't the violence. It was the logic, the cold, insane, bureaucratic reason for it all. To prevent the chaos of the old world, they had created a perfect, orderly hell. "What do you do now?" Brody asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We do our job," Jones said. His men were already bringing in a heavy lead-lined container. "We contain the object, and we contain the information." He looked at Frank, then at Brody. "Which means we need to contain the people who have been exposed." Outside, Frank could hear the sound of engines. Not cars, something bigger. He looked out the window and saw olive green military trucks rolling into town, blocking off the main street. Harmony Creek was being cut off from the rest of the world. They weren't just taking the sphere, they were taking the whole town. The internet blinked out. The only information the outside world got was a brief news report about a sudden aggressive viral outbreak, requiring a federal quarantine. The story was neat, clean, and terrifying enough to keep anyone from asking too many questions. For the people inside, it was like being trapped in a bell jar. The initial reaction was confusion, then anger. People gathered at the roadblocks, shouting at the silent, helmeted soldiers. But the soldiers didn't respond. They were walls of flesh and armor. Mr. Jones and his team set up a command post in the town hall. Frank and Sheriff Brody were kept there for advisory purposes, which was a polite way of saying they were under house arrest. From the window of the mayor's office, they watched their town transform. Humvees patrolled the quiet residential streets. Soldiers went door to door, not with guns raised, but with clipboards and medical kits. They were testing people, they said, checking for the virus. But Frank knew what they were really doing. They were looking for the infected, the carriers of the future. The first to be taken was Millie. 2 soldiers and a woman in a lab coat escorted her from her small house. Millie didn't fight. She walked with them calmly, a small, serene smile on her face. As she passed the town hall, she looked up and saw Frank in the window. "It's better this way," she called out, her voice clear and untroubled. "No more tears, ever." They took Hank the handyman next. He put up a fight. They had to sedate him. He was screaming about how they couldn't take him. He still had so many things left to burn. Deputy Peters was quietly relieved of his badge and gun and led to a waiting ambulance. He didn't say anything at all. He just kept looking at the grass on the town square, as if expecting it to scream. The town was being methodically purged of the spay. Here is influence. The people who had touched the future were being erased from the present. Frank and Brody sat in the office, watching it all unfold. The helplessness was a physical weight. "This is wrong, Jim," Frank said for the 10th time. "They're treating them like lab rats." "What do you want me to do, Frank?" Brody's voice was heavy with defeat. His sheriff's uniform felt like a costume. He had no authority here. "I'm just a man with a tin star in a town that doesn't exist anymore." Later that day, Jones came to see them. He brought a tray with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of sandwiches. The gesture was so normal, it was bizarre. "They're being taken to a secure medical facility," Jones said, placing the tray on the desk. "They'll be comfortable, they'll be studied, but they will never leave." "Studied? For what?" Brody demanded. "To see how fast they go crazy." "To see how the psychic contagion spreads," Jones corrected him coolly. "To understand the mechanism. The probe you found is the most potent one we've ever encountered. The visions are clearer, more structured. It's a treasure trove of data." "Data?" Frank spit the word out. "You are talking about people's minds, my neighbors." Jones took a slow sip of his coffee. "Mr. Sullivan, do you know what the Great Plague did to Europe in the 14th century? It killed 1/3 of the population. It was a historical cataclysm. But it also broke the back of the feudal system. It led to advancements in medicine. It paved the way for the Renaissance. Every horror has its purpose, its lesson. We are here to learn the lesson of this horror, so that the future it shows us never comes to pass." "By locking people up?" "By creating your own little police state right here in Nebraska," Brody shot back. "The future shown by the probe is a planetary police state that practices ritual cannibalism for entertainment," Jones said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling tone. "I will sacrifice this town and 100 towns like it to prevent that. My conscience is perfectly clear on the matter." He stood up, his coffee untouched. "The object is being transported to a secure site. We will be pulling out within 48 hours. The quarantine will remain in effect for another month, for observation. Then we will lift it. The official story will be that the virus was contained and burned itself out. The missing people will be listed as casualties of the outbreak. It's a clean narrative." He paused at the door. "You two will be released. You've been helpful. But I advise you to forget everything you've seen and heard. Forgetting is a survival skill we cultivate in our line of work. You should learn it." After he left, Frank walked to the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town square. It looked so peaceful. But it was a lie. It was a stage after the first act of a tragedy. The main actors had been dragged off, and the remaining cast was left to wonder what came next. It was in the memory of a screaming flower, in the logic of a world without sadness. It was in him. He hadn't just touched the sphere. He had been touched by it. And as darkness fell on Harmony Creek, Frank felt a cold certainty that the real horror hadn't even started yet. The night after Jones and his men took the sphere away was the quietest night Frank had ever experienced. The military trucks were still there, silent sentinels at the edge of town, but the active purging had stopped. The town was holding its breath. Frank couldn't sleep. He lay in the cot they'd set up for him in the town hall, staring at the ceiling. The visions didn't flicker at the edges of his mind anymore. They were inside him now, a permanent part of his mental landscape. He could walk through the field of glass whenever he closed his eyes. He could hear the silent scream of the woman on the chrome table. He had been spared, but he felt more contaminated than any of them. Why had Jones let him and Brody go? Because they hadn't touched the sphere directly. It was a flimsy reason. Jones didn't do flimsy. There was another motive. Maybe they were the control group, the ones left behind to see what happened next. He got up and walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping town. And then it hit him, a new vision. It wasn't a flash this time. It was a slow, creeping understanding, a story unfolding in his head, as clear and detailed as a memory of his own life. It was the why, the missing piece. He saw a world centuries from now, a world that had finally achieved everything humanity had ever dreamed of. There was no more war, no more poverty, no more disease. Global unity had been achieved. But it was a fragile piece, built on a mountain of skulls from the Unity Wars and the Great Simplification. The people of this perfect future were terrified of their own past, of the savage, bloodthirsty creatures they had once been. They lived in constant fear of backsliding, of the old chaos returning. They needed an outlet, a pressure valve. They needed an enemy to unite against, to remind them of how far they'd come. But there were no aliens knocking at their door. There were no monsters left to slay. So they created them. The vision shifted. He was in a laboratory, sterile and white. It wasn't a place of healing, it was a factory. He saw people, ordinary citizens, being led into chambers. They weren't fighting. They were willing volunteers. Or perhaps they were chosen by lottery. It was a great honor, a societal duty. They called it the tithe. Inside the chambers, a process unfolded, a terrifying reverse-engineered evolution. Advanced technology, the same that had cured all disease, was used to rewrite their genetic code, to strip away their intelligence, their language, their humanity, to awaken dormant, primitive traits. He watched in horror as a man's features coarsened, his jaw elongating, his skin thickening into a tough gray hide. His fingers fused and sharpened into claws. His eyes, which had held a look of serene acceptance, became vacant, feral, and full of a simple, burning hunger. They weren't making monsters. They were unmaking people. They called the finished products remnants. Then Frank saw where they put the remnants. Vast, enclosed territories, built to look like the wild, chaotic landscapes of old Earth. Ruined cities, overgrown jungles, blasted deserts. And into these preserves, the citizens of the perfect future would go on historical excursions. They would don the silver armor Frank had seen in his first vision. They would carry the screaming light rifles. They would hunt the remnants for sport, for catharsis, for a thrilling reminder of their own civilized superiority. It was the ultimate perversion. The perpetual harvest. It wasn't a war, it was a theme park. A bloody, horrific, necessary theme park that kept their sterile utopia running. They took a portion of their own people, turned them into monsters, and then slaughtered them as a form of civic engagement. Genghis Khan, the Spanish Inquisition, the Holocaust, they were all just clumsy, inefficient outbursts. This future was worse. It was atrocity by design. It was genocide as a public utility. Frank stumbled back from the window, gasping, his hands on his head. He finally understood the smiling child with the broken skull. In that future, violence wasn't an act of anger or hatred. It was a game, a lesson, a normal part of growing up. He had to find Brody. He ran out of the office and down the hall to the room where the sheriff was staying. He burst in without knocking. Brody was sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at his own hands. "Jim, I saw it," Frank panted. "I saw the whole thing. Why they do it?" Brody looked up, and Frank's blood ran cold. The sheriff's eyes had the same look Dr. Aris had when he woke up on the gurney. A look of terrible, lucid understanding. "I know, Frank," Brody said, his voice flat. "I just saw it too. He hadn't touched the sphere, but the contagion didn't need touch anymore. It was airborne. It was in the very air of Harmony Creek. They don't just hunt them, Frank," Brody added, his voice cracking. "The armor they wear, it records everything. The fear of the remnants, the thrill of the hunt. It's the most popular form of entertainment. They broadcast it. People watch it at home with their families." Frank felt the last bit of floor drop out from under him. They hadn't just weaponized their own people. They had turned their own self-destruction into a spectacle. The probe wasn't just showing them the future. It was showing them the trailer for the longest-running, most popular show in human history. The next morning, a strange sense of calm had settled over the town hall. It wasn't peace. It was the quiet of a shared, unspeakable secret. Both Frank and Brody now carried the full weight of the future in their heads. The knowledge was a physical thing, a cold stone in the pit of the stomach. They found Dr. Aris in the library, a room they hadn't been in yet. He wasn't in a coma anymore. Jones's people had brought him back from the county hospital sometime during the night. He was sitting at a large oak table, surrounded by books on history, sociology, and physics. He had a notepad in front of him, and he was writing furiously, his pen scratching against the paper. He looked up as they entered, and his eyes were sharp and clear, but they held the same haunted look as theirs. "They're not just probes," Aris said without any preamble. "That's what the government men call them. It's an insufficient term. They're not sending a message. They're not issuing a warning." "We know," Brody said, his voice rough. "We saw." "No, you saw the what?" Aris corrected him, tapping his temple with a thin finger. "I saw the why. Not why the future is the way it is. Why the probe is here. Think about it. What kind of civilization builds these things? A civilization that travels between the stars, that observes other species. They are cosmic anthropologists. Or perhaps cosmic archaeologists." He stood up and began to pace, his mind working a mile a minute. Imagine a species that has seen thousands of civilizations rise and fall. They've seen it all. The wars, the triumphs, the extinctions. After a while, the patterns must become boring, predictable. Most species probably just wipe themselves out with nukes or pollute their planet to death. Simple, brutish ends. "But humanity," Aris continued, a note of something like awe in his voice. "We're different. We are uniquely, creatively, spectacularly self-destructive. We don't just kill ourselves, we turn it into an art form. We build a utopia on the foundation of a perpetual atrocity. We turn our brothers into monsters so we can feel heroic hunting them. We make our own damnation the cornerstone of our culture. He stopped pacing and looked at them, his eyes burning. To a species of cosmic collectors, we're not just another failed experiment. We are a masterpiece. We are the Mona Lisa of self-inflicted horror. Frank felt a profound chill. So the probe. It's a museum piece, Aris exclaimed, throwing his hands in the air. Or a recording device for one. It's not a warning to help us change our future. It's a testament, meant to be viewed after we are gone. It's here to record our magnum opus of a downfall. The visions it imparts are its way of cataloging the culture that will produce such a unique end. It's imprinting the key psychological elements onto a sample of the population. Our fears, our desires, our twisted logic. It's taking a cultural snapshot. Brody sank into a chair. So we're just an exhibit. The grand finale of one, Aris confirmed. They thought humanity's history was bloody. That was just the primitive art. The cave paintings, the future it shows. That's the grand, baroque, horrifying symphony. And this probe is the archival recording of the score. A terrifying thought bloomed in Frank's mind. Jones and his people. They know this? Aris nodded grimly. Of course they do. Their talk of preventing the future is a lie. You can't prevent it. The probe isn't showing a possibility. It's showing the result of what we already are. It's a diagnosis of a terminal illness. Jones isn't a doctor trying to cure the disease. He's an undertaker, trying to ensure the burial is quiet and doesn't alarm the neighbors. Frank thought about the people who had been taken away. Millie, Hank, Peters. They weren't being studied to prevent the future. They were the first artifacts for the collection. They were the primary sources, the living documents of the beginning of the end. And Frank, Brody, and Aris. They were being left behind. But why? If it's a test, Brody said slowly, thinking out loud, every test has a purpose. What is this one testing for? It's not a test for us, Aris said quietly, his brief scientific excitement fading back into despair. It's a test of us. The probe imprints the knowledge. The alien archivists then observe what the society does with that knowledge. Does it fracture? Does it try to change? Does it perhaps accelerate its own demise? He looked out the window at the quiet town. They're not just recording the future. They're recording how we react to knowing about it. That's the final piece of the exhibit. The reaction of the primitives to seeing their own exquisite corpse. And in that moment, Frank understood. The real test wasn't for humanity as a whole. It was for Harmony Creek right here, right now. The day Jones and his men were scheduled to leave, the bell jar over Harmony Creek began to crack. The knowledge, the terrible, shared secret, had festered for 2 days. It hadn't united the remaining townsfolk in fear. It had divided them. It started subtly. A fight broke out at the town's only grocery store over the last loaf of bread. It wasn't a normal argument. It was vicious, filled with a strange, righteous fury. Old man Hemlock, who ran the hardware store, accused his neighbor of hoarding. "You are thinking only of yourself," he'd screamed, his face purple. "That's the old way. That's the sickness." The words sent a shiver down Frank's spine. Hemlock had never touched the sphere. He hadn't seen the visions. But the ideas, the logic of the future, were leaking out, spreading like a contagion of thought from the few who knew to the many who didn't. The seeds planted by the prop were sprouting. Frank, Brody, and Aris saw it happening from the town hall. They were the only ones who understood the language being spoken. When people started talking about the greater good and the need for painful sacrifices, they knew it wasn't patriotism. It was the echo of the Great Simplification. When a group of teenagers started a neighborhood watch that was more like a gang of bullies, enforcing a grim, silent order, they saw the first hints of the silver-armored hunters. The town was turning into a microcosm of the future it was supposed to be afraid of. The breaking point came that afternoon. A small group of people, led by a fiery woman named Brenda, who had lost her son to the supposed virus. He had been one of the first taken away, marched on the town hall. They weren't sad. They were furious. But their anger was directed at the wrong people. They weren't shouting at the government men, they were shouting at their neighbors. "There are weak links among us," Brenda cried, her voice ringing across the town square. "People who hold us back, people who cling to the old ways of thinking, of feeling. We have to be strong. We have to be unified. We have to cut out the rot before it spreads." She had never touched the sphere. She had never seen a vision, but she was speaking its language perfectly. The logic of a world without sadness, the logic of burning memories, it had all filtered down to her, twisted into a new, ugly shape. Brody went out to face them. He stood on the steps of the town hall, his sheriff's uniform looking old and powerless. "Brenda, go home," he said, his voice tired. "This isn't the way." "You are one of them," a man in the crowd yelled. "You are one of the weak ones. You cling to the past." "This isn't about strength," Brody pleaded. "It's about decency. It's about being neighbors." Brenda laughed a harsh, ugly sound. "Neighbors? Look around, Sheriff. Our neighbors were taken away in the night. Decency is a luxury we can't afford. The future requires a cleaner slate." Frank stood in the doorway watching in horror. This was the test Aris had talked about. This was the reaction. The probe had shown them a future of systematic cruelty, and their response was to start practicing it on a small scale immediately. They were so terrified of the monster in the mirror that they were becoming it, just to prove they could control it. The standoff escalated. The crowd grew larger, angrier. They weren't a mob. Mobs are chaotic. This was something worse. It was an organized, self-righteous movement. They had a purpose. They were going to purify the town. It was then that Mr. Jones appeared. He walked through the crowd which parted for him as if he were a ghost. He stood next to Brody on the steps. He looked out at the angry faces, at Brenda's zealous eyes, at the men holding makeshift clubs. He showed no emotion. He just watched. He turned to Brody, his voice a low whisper that only Frank and the sheriff could hear. "Do you see now? The probe isn't a cause. It's a catalyst. It just speeds up what's already there. This is humanity's default setting." He looked at Frank. "You saw the harvest, Mr. Sullivan. The hunt. It seems so monstrous. But what if it's the only thing that works? What if it's the only way to keep this?" He gestured to the angry crowd. "From becoming the everyday reality for everyone? A little bit of hell to maintain a lot of heaven." Frank felt a wave of nausea. Jones wasn't just an undertaker. He was a believer. He saw the logic in the future. Maybe he even saw the necessity. The crowd surged forward. A rock was thrown, shattering one of the town hall windows. The chaos was about to begin. The first battle of the Unity Wars fought with sticks and stones in a small town in Nebraska. The future wasn't centuries away. It was here. It was now. And the probe, wherever it was, had finished its recording. This was the final scene of the exhibit. the moment the subjects received the diagnosis and chose to embrace the disease. As the first punch was thrown in the crowd below, a sound cut through the air. It wasn't the sound of sirens or shouts. It was a high-pitched, piercing whine that made everyone, from Brenda's mob to Brody himself, clap their hands over their ears. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. It vibrated in their bones, rattled their teeth. The crowd wavered, their anger momentarily forgotten in the face of this new physical pain. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. Into the ringing silence that followed, Jones spoke, his voice unnaturally calm and clear. "The experiment is over." He didn't need to shout. His words carried across the square with an eerie clarity. Everyone looked at him. He was just a man in a suit, but he now held the attention of the entire town. "You have all performed admirably," he said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. It was the most emotion Frank had ever seen him display, and it was terrifying. "You have provided us with invaluable data on societal stress responses and mimetic contagion." Brody stared at him, his face a mask of dawning horror. "What are you talking about? What experiment?" "The quarantine, Sheriff," Jones said, turning to him. "The virus, the limited information. Leaving you three," he nodded at Frank, Brody, and Iris, "as vectors of information. It was all a controlled environment. We needed to see how the knowledge would disseminate. We needed to see if a society, when shown its own capacity for monstrousness, would recoil from it or replicate it." He gestured to the now confused and silent crowd. "The results are conclusive. You replicate." Frank finally understood the cold, brutal truth. Jones and his organization weren't just undertakers or believers. They were zookeepers. They weren't trying to stop the future or learn from it. They were a part of it. They were the architects of the great simplification, the managers of the perpetual harvest. The men in suits were the ancestors of the men in silver armor. The probe wasn't an alien artifact they had found. It was their own device. It wasn't a warning from the future. It was a recruitment tool. "You are one of them," Frank whispered, the words catching in his throat. "From the future." Jones's smile widened slightly. "Not from. For we are the foundation. We are the ones who do the necessary work now, so that the stability of tomorrow can be built. We guide the trajectory. We identify the fault lines in a society. We find towns like this one, introduce a catalyst, and observe. We are looking for the most efficient path to the world you saw, Mr. Sullivan. A world without the chaos you see before you. A world of order." The chilling logic settled over Frank. They were pruning the human race. They were testing methodologies on living subjects, refining their techniques for the global stage. Harmony Creek wasn't a tragedy. It was a field test. "So, what now?" Brody asked, his hand drifting towards the pistol he no longer wore. "Do you just kill us all? Is that the clean narrative?" "Kill you?" Jones said, as if the idea were absurd. "Number, that would be a waste of resources. The experiment in this location is over, but the subjects are still valuable." He raised a small remote from his pocket and pressed a button. From the side streets, the military trucks started their engines, but they weren't leaving. They were moving in. Soldiers disembarked, but this time they weren't carrying clipboards. They carried rifles that Frank recognized with a sickening jolt. They were early, clunky prototypes of the screaming light weapons from his vision. "Some of you will be taken for further study," Jones announced to the terrified town. "Your emotional responses are noteworthy. Others. His eyes scanned the crowd, lingering on the angriest, most zealous faces like Brenda's. Show potential. The capacity to make the hard choices. You will be offered a place in our organization. A chance to be on the right side of history. The rest. Jones didn't say. He didn't have to. They would be the casualties of the virus, the waste material of the experiment. Jones looked at Frank one last time. You see, Mr. Sullivan, the past wasn't bloody enough. It was messy, inefficient. What we are building is a future where every drop of blood has a purpose. Every scream is a data point. Every death serves the system. He turned and walked down the steps, his men in suits flanking him. The soldiers were advancing, forming a perimeter around the town square, their movements precise and practiced. The townsfolk were no longer a mob. They were just scared, trapped animals. Frank stood on the steps next to Brody and Eris and looked up at the sky. It was a clear, brilliant blue, a perfect day. He thought about the history he'd learned in school, about the tyrants and the wars and the genocides. He had always thought of them as humanity's greatest failures. He was wrong. They were just rough drafts. They were the clumsy, passionate, chaotic attempt. Now, here in his own small town, he was seeing the beginning of the final, polished manuscript. A history so bloody, so calculated, and so endless that it would make all the horrors of the past seem like a golden age. The future hadn't been a warning. It had been a promise, and the delivery had just begun.